representation, which is not the case. And unfortunately this left, and I'm on the left myself, has this very sad affliction of defending Islamism and reaction wherever it can at people's expense all the time. And they've all lined up to welcome Islamism's role in the region. And organizations like Human Rights Watch, I know they're supposed to be a human rights organization, but for example, in a recent report they issued, they said that the international community has to come to terms with political Islam because it represents a majority preference, and that it is a movement that is the antithesis of autocratic rule. Not true. Islamism is autocratic rule as well. And even if a majority wants something, it doesn't necessarily make it right. But again, was Islamism the preference and the spirit of the revolutions? If you look at what the demands were, what sparked those revolutions, and the fact that Islamism had a very little role in the movements to begin with. It's a distortion to say that Islamism is the result of majority wish and rule. As the Marxist Mansour Hekmat has said, bourgeois society has succeeded in substituting the concept of freedom and the struggle for it by that of democracy. And by doing so, it has managed to predetermine the extent of the onset of the subjugated classes in their search for freedom, as well as the eventual shape of their victory. For people in the region, that's all they get, Islamic democracy. And commentators will say that Islamism, there's nothing wrong with Islamism. It's just Muslims involved in the public space. Nonsense. Islamism is first and foremost a far-right political movement, and it no more represents Muslims, or those who are labeled as such, as far-right parties in Europe represent all Christians or Europeans. And in addition to that, I mean, Muslims are not a homogeneous community. There are communists and atheists and socialists and freethinkers and secularists and people who would even consider themselves Muslims but don't want to live under Sharia law and hate and despise Islamism. Conflating Islamism with Muslims is part of this effort to feign representation. And in fact, if you look at Islamism, it's part of the project to control people and restrict their rights and freedoms. It's not an exercise in people's democratic intervention. What the Islamists are doing is they're attempting to hijack the revolutions. This is not one and the same with them representing the revolutions. And in Iran, we've had this experience where a left-leaning revolution was smashed and crushed and expropriated by the Islamic movement. And since history is written by victors, it is now very often labeled an Islamic revolution. And it certainly doesn't make Islamism a force that needs to be welcomed and supported. Now, commentators have said that Islamists can be Democrats. They may not be secularists, but they can be Democrats. But this is untrue. Religion in power is the end of any form of democratic politics. The postmodernist left that supports Islamism because its enemy's enemy is its ally, and due to, in fact, its Eurocentric and racist aligning with the ruling elites in the colonies, irrespective of what happens in those colonies, it ignores what Islamism actually means for people in the region and for the revolution. They're not concerned with equality, with social justice, with class politics. And they call it, these are the post-Islamists. That's a new term. Because they have promised to be moderate in their politics. Moderation, when religion is in power, lacks any real meaning. Now, one of the members of the Freedom Justice Party has said, for example, we cannot draft a law that says unveiled women will be forbidden from this or that, but we must make her feel that her punishment is in the afterlife. Some moderation. And we've already seen, despite all this talk of moderation, restrictions on people's rights, curtailment of free expression, and an attack on activists and secularists. But nonetheless, this is not, if the Islamists in Egypt, for example, seem moderate, it's not thanks to the Islamists, it's thanks to the revolution that places constraints on them so that they have to pretend to be moderate. I don't know why Islamists always get credit for what people do. In Iran, you have a reformist faction that exists because of the explosive situation in Iran, and if anything, if there's any opening and people push their veils back a little bit, it's thanks, they always say it's thanks to the reformists. No, it's thanks to people's resistance and the spaces that they've created that doesn't allow Islamists to do as they choose. In fact, if you look at Islamism nowadays, it's a reaction to the move away in our societies from more traditional values. And it's these revolutionary forces, not the Islamists, that we should be defending and strengthening. The space that the revolutions have opened up will not be closed easily. But like anything else in the world, it depends on human will and intervention. The forces of reaction have lined up in defense of Islamism. We must in turn line up to defend the revolutionary aspirations, secularism, equality, real freedom, and a concept of citizenship that's not linked with religion. Before I end, I also want to say a few words about freedom of expression and its importance, not just for people in Sweden and Britain and Europe, but in the region as well. In the West, and you're seeing these excuses and bogus allegations being translated now and used against activists in the region, the fundamental debate about free expression and Islam is being discussed and framed within a bogus context of offense, Islamophobia, and racism. And in some ways, these accusations serve Islamism in the same way that Sharia law helps it when it has power. It helps them to threaten, it helps them to intimidate and silence any criticism and defense. In my opinion, charges of Islamophobia and offense are equivalent to secular fatwas. It's a warning by the powers that be of what is acceptable to say and what is not, what is sacred and cannot and must not be challenged. A defense, very often by progressives, by people who consider themselves defenders of free expression, but not very good ones. A defense of this polite and inoffensive and respectful free expression is no defense at all, because it aids and abets Islamism at the expense of those who are opposing it and resisting it day in and day out. And it fails to recognize the realities of this movement, which is spearheading what I call an Islamic imposition, and that is the cause of incalculable misery and barbarity worldwide. Islamophobia is another bogus and political term used to scaremonger people into silence by attributing human qualities to Islam and Islamism so as to rule out and deem racist any criticism and dissent. But criticism of a belief is not racism. And in my opinion, these concepts are not there to protect Muslims from bigotry, which we must do unequivocally, but they are there to protect Islam and Islamism. And like any belief system, Islam must be open to criticism. It cannot be off limits. Those who say criticism is offensive want to challenge those that want to change society. It's a means of control, censorship, and limiting rights. And limiting free expression to that which is acceptable is a restriction, particularly of the rights of those who need free expression the most. It's telling people who need it most that they cannot say certain things. And in an era where people are being hung in city squares for crimes against chastity, they're being buried in ditches to their waist or their breast